Perfect. So today we are going to start a new topic, which is defense against attacks. So what kind of strategies, what kind of control strategies against attacks? So let me remind you again how the general systems work. We have actuator, we have plant, we have sensor, this is the channel, and then there is a big block here, and I'm going to redraw the big block there, which gets the information YT and outputs information UT. Actually, let me just draw it in that block itself. We have one block for estimator, one block for detector, one block for planning, one block for control. And all the attacks will happen here. Okay. So the thing is that the reason why we say that the attack is happening in the channel is because typically, in most cases, the attacks are likely on the information that is getting into the system or the information that is coming out of the system and getting into the actuator. So that's where most of the attacks would happen. Even if they launch a virus or a worm, they are essentially changing the readings that are going into these blocks. Of course, you can also envision a scenario where you can change the estimation algorithm itself or change the detection algorithm itself. Usually those attacks are much harder to do. So in most situations, the attacker is either trying to sway the information in their favor within this block, or they are swaying the information coming out of it, which is feeding into the actuator. So that's why, typically people say that the attack is happening in the channel layer, and those are the attacks that are very well studied in the literature. Can someone tell me where the Jeep Cherokee attack was happening? Anyone remembers? So remember, in the Jeep Cherokee case, it was able to change the information that is coming on the dashboard of the person, of the driver. So that was the attack in the sensing space. So the sensor was sending Sensor was sending the information to the human being. The human being was doing all of this stuff. So human being was also the state estimator, it was also the detector, it was also doing planning, and it was also doing control. So that information was getting fed to the human being, and that information was getting corrupted, at least the one that are coming on the dashboard. So human can still see on the road, but at least the dashboard part, the human could see that things are going haywire on the dashboard. And then the information, the human was trying to press the brake, but the brake wasn't getting applied on the actuator, or the human was trying to steer the car, but the steering action was not getting applied to the actuator. So that particular attack was also on this particular side. So the Jeep Cherokee example, they attacked on this side as well as they attacked on this side of the equation of this channel. Any question? Yes.
So for autonomous vehicle,
Yes.
there are like some research related to the CAN bus attack.
That's right.
But the CAN bus should be in the block under the channel.
Yeah, the CAN bus is also a channel actually. It's a broadcast channel. Yeah. So all attacks are actually happening in the channel itself. All the CAN bus attacks are basically channel attacks. One of the attacks that we studied on the CAN bus, so CAN bus is basically a broadcast channel within vehicles, within a lot of systems, like it will be in aircraft, it will be in vehicles, it will be in trucks, buses, and so on. So in any real-time control system which is embodied on a vehicle, on a system like a ship, those kind of places, they will have CAN buses. So CAN bus has a lot of security mechanisms. So sometimes the attacks are trying to target the security mechanism within the CAN bus itself. So for instance, one of the attacks we studied was called a bus-off attack on the CAN bus, wherein what happens is if there is a lot of collision between the packets, then as a security countermeasure, the CAN bus stops that particular node. So if a node is causing a lot of collision in the packet during transmission, it causes that node to shut down. So that's a defense mechanism. Now you have a legitimate node that is legitimately trying to communicate, and another node within the network, an attacker node, is trying to create a mechanism for collision every time that particular node is communicating, and that causes that node to shut down, the legitimate node to shut down. So sometimes the attackers are attacking, but with the objective of trying to shut down one of these blocks within the system. So that could also happen. But that's where the control strategies against attacks, you don't really have too many general strategies. We will talk about some general stuff in the class, but when you get into the nitty-gritties of individual systems, it becomes that's where you can actually do a lot more innovation. So general stuff is very hard to come up with in this context. So far, what all things have we studied in the course? So in the early parts of the course, we talked about planning and control. So we talked about PID controller, we talked about lead lag controller, and then for the planning part, we talked about optimization dynamic programming algorithm. So that was for the planning part. So we have talked about planning and control at the very beginning. You've also done a few implementation of planning and control. So JSQ policy that you were doing, joint shortest queue policy, that's a control policy, right? So you have implemented some planning and control policies already on various assignments. The estimator part is Kalman filtering. We talked about Kalman filtering, which is the estimator part. The detector part, which is attack detection algorithms. We have studied a lot of detection algorithms that will go here. So estimator is typically Kalman filter. Detection algorithms we have already talked about. Planning and control algorithms, we have talked about it. Now whatever algorithms we come up with in the coming lectures, we are basically focusing on this part. Again, we are going back to this planning and control part and trying to figure out how do we better plan and how do we create controlling mechanisms so that we can do a better detection, a better estimation, and a better planning and a better control in order to make sure that the plant is meeting the objectives. Typically, the objectives of the plant, who decides what the objective of the plant should be? Who decides the objectives of the plant? What is the plant supposed to do?
Human.
Sorry? Human, I mean, of course, everything is decided by human, but what kind of human? They have typically a tag associated with them. Anyone knows? So I'll give you some examples, okay, just so that you know what the decision-making body is. So if you go to a biology lab, typically there are rats and viruses and bacteria and whatever, and OSU has a fairly big biology labs. So in those labs, the temperature, what the temperature setting of those labs are supposed to be, it's decided by some biology professor that, okay, these bacteria are supposed to live at 70 degrees Fahrenheit, so the temperature has to be 70 degrees Fahrenheit at all points of time, okay? So that's in the biology lab. If you go to the autonomous vehicle, who decides what the plant's behavior should be under attack? It's the regulating agency. So they are semi-government agencies, okay? So they are a consortium of industry people who kind of understand the technical details of a vehicle very well, and then there are government people, and they sit down and they decide that if this is the attack, this is how the vehicle should behave. If this is the attack, this is how the vehicle should behave. And under no circumstances the vehicle should just blow up or crash into other vehicles and things like that, right? So they decide what the plant's behavior is supposed to be. In the case of medical equipments, if you are building a you know those, I don't know if you have been to a ICU or something, but there are like lots of medical equipments that are reading your blood pressure, your heart rate, and a lot of other medical parameters. So in those cases, FDA decides. FDA is again a regulating agency. So they decide against what attacks these plants have to be immune to, what should the communication protocol be, if there is an attack of this type, then how should the plant behave in those situations. So typically, the optimal behavior or the behavior that the plant must satisfy under attack is something that's determined by the regulating agencies and industry consortiums and then there are of course the industry experts, subject matter experts. So if you go to GE, General Electric, and if you work in their energy division and you are responsible for attack detection and mitigation for their wind farms, if that is what your job profile looks like, then in that case some subject matter expert within General Electric will tell you that these are the behaviors that we would like to have in the plant in case of attacks of this type. Okay. Typically these things are, if you look at, what are those called? I think I have uploaded a few documents that talks about what happens under attack. In the case of vehicles, I think it's called technical specifications document or something like that. So those documents are there in the Carmen folder, so you can go back and read up on some specific situations, what kind of behavior is desirable and undesirable under attack. When we are talking about attackers, you can have very different types of attackers with very different motivations. So it's very important to know the motivation and the restrictions. On attacker. If you recall the Jeep Cherokee example, I'm going to go back to that example because that was one of the attacks that is in the public domain, thankfully. And you have videos so you can clearly see what is happening during the attack. What was the motivation of the attacker in that case? In the Jeep Cherokee example? Anyone remembers? They just wanted to demonstrate that an attack can happen. That's it. That was their motivation. Their motivation was not to cause any harm to anyone. What were the restrictions on the attacker? What could they do and not do? Actually, it turns out they could do anything. It was really an open system. Like, they figured out exactly what the communication protocol within the channel is, and they could press the brake, they could turn on the wipers, they could change the readings on the dashboard, they can change the music, they can change the volume of the music, they could literally do anything and everything. So they did not really have any restriction, but they had benign motivation. Their motivation was just to demonstrate the attack, not to hurt someone. Now, what you will notice is if you have like the motivation axis and the restrictions axis, you can have attacks all over the place. That depends on the system design, and that depends on the amount of money the attackers have to cause that particular attack. So when you are designing the control strategies, unfortunately, you do need some prior information about the motivation and restriction. So motivation will tell you where in this system are they going to attack. Are they attacking on this side? Are they attacking on this side? Are they attacking on the estimator? Are they going to cause some inbuilt mechanism to shut down? So all of that is important to know, and that's what will allow you to figure out what is it that they are doing, where exactly are they going to attack in this whole situation. So that's why motivation is important. And then restriction is important because if the attacker is unrestricted, then they can cause whatever the heck they want to do because they have that power to do it. So many a times when we are coming up with control strategies against attacks, which is called response, response against attack, we generally allow some sort of restriction on the attacker behavior, because if we do not assume any restriction on the attacker, then the attacker can do whatever, no matter what control strategies you pick. Okay, so we will not talk about motivation in this class, even though it's an important part, primarily because if you look at the cybersecurity landscape, the motivation is typically people are very ill-informed about the motivation because it's very difficult to know what the motivation of the counterparty is going to be. Restrictions, on the other hand, is somewhat easier to assess because that's somehow inbuilt within the physical system itself, what the restrictions are going to be. So sometimes you have a powerful attacker and no response works. You can have stealthy attacker and you can come up with a good response scheme to fight against a stealthy attacker, and then the C could be a weak attacker, and you don't have to worry about the weak attacker. Probably some simple scheme will work. Simple response. If you have a GPS spoofer, what is the radius of the spoofing radius, like where the GPS signal will get garbled? Typically, it will be of the order of a kilometer or so, like 500 meters, 1 kilometer, and so on. So that's the restriction on the attacker. That of course depends on the strength of the spoofer, but those are the restrictions on the attacker. Sometimes the restriction could be because of the physical size of the attacker. So in the battlefield, when you want to jam signals, if you want to jam a signal very strongly, you need a much bigger jammer. On the other hand, if you just want to jam signals locally, you need a very small jammer. So again, the size of the hardware kind of sort of also restricts how much the attacker can attack the system. So just keep in mind, you can have powerful attacker, you can have stealthy attacker. So what's the goal of a stealthy attacker? Stealthy attacker just wants to remain undetected. So it doesn't want to spook the detector. It wants to remain undetected. That's what the goal of a stealthy attacker is. But you can always come up with good response strategies in order to be robust against stealthy attacker. Okay, so instead of taking an average, you can take a median, for instance, of random variables in order to beat the stealthy attacker. The weak attacker is like, I don't have any motivation, I'm just kind of attacking for fun. And there, of course, you do need some response schemes, but it has to be a weak response scheme. So to give you an example, you can come up with a radio hack to jam the train signals, like the signals that the train drivers are using for communicating with each other. So there are many such attacks that have been documented, and it has actually led to derailment of the trains also. So all of these $20 radio signal jammer that you can just have in your hands, you can actually jam the signal between one train operator talking to another train operator and thereby cause the train to derail. So that kind of stuff has happened. And in those cases, it's a weak attacker, but you can have a simple response scheme, which is if the information is jammed, you kind of get the train to a standstill so that the train is not moving, and then you can figure things out on how to defeat that particular attacker's objective. Okay. So any questions on this? No? So let's look at some broad theoretical frameworks which allows us to think about how to behave under an attack. So one is when there is packet drop. With acknowledgements. And without acknowledgement. Second is sensor selection. Third is predict. Adversarial actions. Adversaries. Actions and respond. Fourth is assign trust levels to sensors. Okay. So let's look at each of these different broad frameworks. So first is packet drop with acknowledgement. So I'm sending YT to this particular block through the channel, and the attacker is dropping the packets within the channel, but dropping in a random way. However, whenever the packet drops, both the estimator side as well as the sensor side gets to know that the packet has been dropped. So that kind of happens in the CAN bus. So whenever a collision happens in the CAN bus, the communicating node, which is this node, gets to know that actually the packet did not go through the channel and reach the intended recipient. So in that case, sensor gets an acknowledgement packet whether the communication was successful or not successful. So whenever you have the acknowledgement, that's called an acknowledgement. Generally speaking, even though it may not be the right terminology, they call it TCP-like protocol. And wherever there is no acknowledgement, which means that the sensor sent the packet, but the sensor doesn't know if the packet reached the intended recipient or did not reach the intended recipient, then it's called a UDP-like protocol. So TCP-like protocol and UDP-like protocol. Do you know what TCP and UDP is? Okay, so we send an email and we get an acknowledgement that the email was received, email was successfully sent to the receiver. That's TCP-like protocol. So you get a response from your email client. How many of you have used UDP-like protocol? Where do you use UDP? Where there is no acknowledgement.
Sometimes you want to broadcast to all of the internet, like other computer, but you don't need a reply.
Yeah, when do you not need an acknowledgement?
Yes.
When?
When the information is not important.
When information is not important. I mean, that is true, but when is that information not important? Under what circumstances would you use UDP-like protocol where you don't need acknowledgement? So video streaming, audio streaming, calling people on the phone, there is no acknowledgement that comes back. Okay, so that's why we always have to ask, are you able to hear me okay? And then the acknowledgement actually is happening in person rather than happening through the protocol itself. So video transmission, audio transmission, telephonic conversation, all of them are UDP-like protocol because the acknowledgement doesn't come back. But when you are sending email, when you are transmitting information on the CAN bus, you get a acknowledgement, and therefore it's a TCP-like protocol. So CAN protocol is TCP-like protocol because you get the acknowledgement. So now the attacker's job is to increase the drop probability. So under the regular circumstances, I am assured that I'm going to communicate every 10 millisecond on the CAN bus, and I'm assured that by 10, 10.5, 11 millisecond, the information will get transmitted and will reach the intended recipient. However, an attacker can reduce the probability of that transmission, and now instead of communicating every 10 milliseconds, you are communicating sometimes in 10 milliseconds, sometimes in 50 milliseconds. Okay, but you know that there is a packet drop that is happening. So that's number one. The second part is, let's say the sensor is LiDAR, radar, camera, sensors of those type, and now it's generating gigabytes of data or megabytes of data. But the bandwidth is eaten up by the adversary because the adversary is jamming the channel or adversary is causing some interference within the channel. So then the bandwidth became limited. So you could transmit 100 megabytes of data per second, but now you only have 20 megabytes of data available, 20 megabytes of bandwidth available. So now instead of sending 100 images, you can only send 20 images, right? Now the question is, how do you decide which sensors to select and which ones to not select? That's called the sensor selection problem under bandwidth constraint. The third one is you need to predict what the adversary is going to do. So then in this particular situation, you need to know what the motivation of the adversary is. so that you can predict what the adversary is going to do, and then you can respond accordingly. So this is what we had done in the bus-off attack problem, where we had predicted what the adversary's actions are going to be, because it wants to cause the bus-off event on the CAN bus, which allows bus-off event basically shuts down an entire node in the car. So we knew exactly what the adversary's action was directed towards, which was the bus-off event, and then we came up with a response strategy on the basis of adversary's predicted actions. And then the fourth one is you have multiple sensors and you don't really know which sensors are corrupted. So then you have to assign trust level to the sensors so that you can appropriately weigh the information coming from different sensors. To give you an example, it's not an attack example, but I think it's a very good illustrative example. So suppose you have a camera sensor on your autonomous vehicle. Suppose you have 3 camera sensors on your autonomous vehicle, and 2 camera sensor says that there is a bicyclist which is riding on the road, and 1 camera sensor says there is no bicyclist on the road. And you know from your experience that image processing algorithms can have errors when they are processing the images. So all 3 cameras are capturing the image. They are of course capturing the same image but from different angles. And because of the different angles, the information that is coming to the computer is, okay, in two cameras I am seeing a bicyclist, in 1 camera I am not seeing the bicyclist. How are you going to decide whether there is a bicyclist on the road or not? And then you have to behave accordingly, right? You have to act based on that information. So how would you do that? And the thing is, of course, you have LiDAR data, you have camera data, you have radar data. And so now you have 2 cameras saying there is a bicyclist, 1 camera saying there is no bicyclist. There is a LiDAR that's saying there is a bicyclist. And then there is a radar saying there is a metallic object that is moving down the road on this particular side. Now you can say that, okay, look, this camera doesn't feel like very trustworthy. But the camera is not just looking at bicyclists. It might be looking at pedestrians, it might be looking at birds, it might be looking at animals like deers on the road. So now you have to start figuring out how much to trust each of these sensors in different situations. And that trust level has to continue to change, because maybe you have an infrared camera, and that infrared camera is very useful at night, but it's not as useful during the day, because during the day everything is hot. The road is hot, the bridges are hot, the trees are not hot, right? So that's what happens during the day. But at night you want to see if there is a bear down the road, if there is a deer down the road, if there is an elephant crossing the road. So you need to have that information. And so the trust level is something that you keep assigning and keep reassigning to every sensor, so that you can do the information fusion and do the estimation, detection, planning and control based on the trust level that are assigned to different sensors. So these are the 4 general methods. I'm sure there would be many, but more often than not, these are the, like, whenever I've looked at some paper, it basically falls within one of these 4 different categories of response schemes in the context of various autonomous systems. Yes?
So I think for assigning a trust level to sensors, if you consider like the camera case, because when we try to attack the sensors, it
Right.
might be the same situation attack, like maybe we will put some like different light or different.
Correct.
So which means all the camera will be affected.
That's right. But LiDAR may not be affected.
So it's kind of assign a different level for different kind of sensors.
Correct.
Not specific this camera or this camera.
You can have sensor level and you can have category level also. So LiDAR could be like one category, radar could be one category. Each of them are sensing different things. So LiDAR is sensing point cloud. I'm not sure if you have seen this attack, but many years ago, maybe 2015, some researchers took a stop sign. So there is like STOP written on the stop sign, and what they did was they printed on a piece of paper 45 miles per hour and they pasted it on the stop sign. So basically this said 45 miles per hour, and all of this area is red. except for this area because it's printed on a piece of paper and pasted on the stop sign. What do you think the camera is going to do?
Recognize that stop sign.
Recognize it as a stop sign? No, actually it's not what it did. It recognized it as a 45 miles per hour road. So this is also an attack. So here you are attacking the camera, but the LiDAR, because LiDAR doesn't look at what's written, LiDAR looks at the point cloud, so it will be able to come up with this outline that is there. So now your LiDAR is saying there is a stop sign and your camera is saying it's 45 miles per hour. Who are you going to believe? Right? If you have 3 cameras and 1 LiDAR, so your 3 cameras are saying 45 miles per hour, your 1 LiDAR is saying stop sign. How do you assign the trust level? It's a very difficult problem. That's why I feel that autonomous vehicles will never come on the road. But investors think otherwise. You know, NVIDIA is $1 trillion valuation. I don't know. A lot of crazy things are happening in the market, but I really don't think autonomous vehicles is possible because of these attacks. It's very easy. Even a kid, I mean, any 15-year-old can print out 45 miles per hour and paste it on a stop sign. It just doesn't require any effort or skill, but it can spoof a lot of camera sensors on autonomous vehicles. So anyways, this is a big problem. It's also true that camera, and for that matter any computer vision algorithm, is very susceptible to noises. So small change in lighting conditions, small change in noise can lead to large changes in the outputs of the camera. So another example of this trust level. So one of the first fatal accidents that Tesla had, the Tesla's autopilot, or what do they call it? Full self-driving, FSD package. So there are people who buy the FSD package, and then there was this guy who was driving on a road, very long road, state highway. And so the Tesla's camera could not distinguish between the white truck and the white, what is that called? Sky. So cloudy sky. So cloudy sky is white. So it has a white sky, and then there is a white truck underneath it. So it could not detect that boundary, and it could not detect the truck. The truck was crossing the road like this, and so the car was going at 45, 50 miles an hour or whatever, like 60 miles an hour in the full self-driving mode with the driver completely distracted. Okay, and it went and crashed into the truck, and of course the driver died in that unfortunate accident. It was one of the first accidents that Tesla had with full self-driving. There was another full self-driving accident where again the driver was distracted. There was a road divider. You know, like when you are taking an exit, then there is this. So this is your highway, and this is your exit, and there is like some metallic thing here, which kind of differentiates the highway from the exit road, and so the camera could not figure out what this is. So it went and banged into this, and of course the driver died in that particular accident as well. That happened in California, again in full self-driving mode. So camera makes a mistake. You can have 10 cameras, but all 10 cameras can make a mistake. And then the question is, how do you assign the trust level to whatever camera is saying? The camera might be saying there is a car, there is a stop sign, there is 45 miles per hour sign. And now you need to figure out which camera is saying truth, because you could have 2 cameras that are saying truth about something, but 2 other cameras that are saying truth about something else. And you need to fuse all that information. And that all information fusion happens here in the estimator block. And from the estimator block, you kind of figure out whether something is wrong or not. So the trust score thing actually is an iterative process between the estimator and the detector. If the estimator says this is what is happening, then the detector is going to figure out, okay, 5 people are saying the same thing, so I'm going to assign higher trust score to them. This one person seems to be saying something opposite, so I'm going to lower the trust score for that particular one sensor. So that's something that we will study in the context of assigning trust score to the sensor. So now I want to give you the problem formulation. So every class we will talk about one of these 4 different general techniques. And now once you understand the general techniques and you have like a specific problem, you can try to borrow different ideas from different techniques in order to solve that particular problem. So that's roughly what is going to happen. So let's talk about the packet drop with acknowledgement. This is also your assignment problem. This is an assignment 6. So you will be implementing this particular algorithm that we will be talking about today. So I'm going to drop the control packets right now. I have alpha t. The questions I have is, I need to write the performance index. Gamma maps, gamma t maps yt, ys, s is equal to 0 to t to ut. I want to the goal is find an estimator for xt find the optimal control policy gamma 0 to t star. So all of this stuff is from 2004 to 7. This kind of problem statement was studied in that particular timeline. Okay, so let me tell you what is happening here. So I have this control action coming out of the controller. It is going through the channel, and because of the adversary's action, with probability alpha bar, the information is going through. So alpha t equals to 1, and so ut gets applied and influences the state transition function. With probability 1 minus alpha bar, the adversary is able to block the signal from going through the channel, as a result of which this alpha t equals to 0, which means that the control action is not getting applied to the state, to the plant, and so the state transitions as if no control was applied onto the plant, right? That's what this means. Okay, you are making a noisy observation of the state. So this is cxt plus vt. So cxt is measurement of the state, and then there is measurement noise, and you are picking a policy gamma t, which takes as input the entire history of observations you have made, but it can also take alpha t, by the way, because I am getting an acknowledgement, so I can also add alpha s to the mix. So gamma t is getting the information about, remember this packet is originating at the controller level. So the controller knows whether this packet went through successfully or did not go through successfully. So that's alpha s. So if it is a TCP like protocol, then alpha s will be part of gamma t. If it is non-TCP, if it is UDP like protocol, then alpha s will not be part of gamma t, because gamma t doesn't know, the controller doesn't know if the packet has gone through or not. And this is the performance index, the usual tracking performance. So I want to minimize the quadratic function of the state and a quadratic function of the action, but this performance, this metric is only added when alpha t equals to 1, which means that the packet was successfully transmitted. If packet was not successfully transmitted, then there is no control cost, you only have the state cost. So this is the problem, and there are two sub problems to this. First of all, I want to find an estimator for xt. I want to figure out how do I estimate, how does the controller estimate the xt, which is what is happening at the plant level. So I need to come up with a Kalman filter for xt, for estimating xt, and then I need to figure out what is the optimal control policy gamma star t. One thing I want to note here, which is something we haven't studied and we haven't talked about so far, is this concept called separation of estimation and control. So I'm going to talk about it in the next class through this particular example. But typically speaking, in all control systems, we tend to separate the problem of figuring out the estimator from figuring out the control strategy. So remember, estimator sits here in the block and controller sits here, or planning sits here on the block. They are not commingled, they are not in the same block. It allows us to simplify the entire process and debug. So one of the things you should know is as researchers, we care more about being optimal and being true and being correct and being at the minimum solution, at the best solution possible. But when you go to industry, one of the things you will realize is creating a code that is easy to debug and easy to explain to other people has much higher importance than being the best, having the best solution possible that nobody can understand. So this separation of estimation and control allows one engineer to create the estimator and another engineer just to take that estimator as the ground truth and use that for planning and control task. Okay, so this is something that every industry uses, separation of estimation and control. So there is an estimation team that looks after the estimation algorithm, and then there is a planning and control team that looks after the planning and control algorithm. Generally speaking, if you want to minimize this cost, if this is your performance index, you want to minimize the cost by picking an appropriate policy. Generally speaking, estimation and control will not be separated at the optimal solution. You will have a estimator that is influenced by the control policy and a control policy that is influenced by the estimation policy. So whenever you are purposefully separating the estimation and control, you are saying, okay, estimation is done independently of control, you're actually incurring a loss in that process, performance loss. But I think in most cases that performance loss is reasonable, and therefore we always separate out the estimation and the control part. In this particular example, because it's a linear system, alpha t is Bernoulli IID. So alpha t is independent of the past alpha t's, and then the observation is also linear, and then these noises are Gaussian noises. It just turns out that in this particular special case, and also because we have acknowledgement packet, so ACK is there in this particular example. So because we have acknowledgement, because of all these different reasons, it turns out that you can really separate the estimation and control part and come up with an estimator for xt using an algorithm, and then use that estimator for the planning purposes and for the control purposes. So it turns out to be optimal, but it's generally not optimal. However, whenever you are enforcing this separation, you are incurring a loss, but in most cases that loss is reasonable. Just something to keep in mind. And sometimes if you are facing an issue where you are estimating and you are controlling separately and things are not working out, it is quite likely because of the reason that these two are supposed to be coupled at the optimal solution, but because you are enforcing that, it may not work out in all systems. So just something to keep in the back of the mind when you are designing this estimator and controllers in your future career. In the next class, I'm going to talk about Kalman filtering for estimating xt, and then I'm going to talk about computing the control policy, optimal control policy for this particular problem. So if there are any questions, I'll be taking it now, or if there are no questions, we'll meet on Friday. Okay, awesome. One thing to keep in mind or think about for the next 2 weeks, how are you going to assign trust level if different people are giving you different information? By the way, if you go and ask CEOs of companies like big companies, and if you go and ask President of the United States, which changed by the way, so this is their biggest problem in life. And their biggest problem is they talk to like 500 people every day, and each of those 500 people are saying completely different things. And they need to assign the trust score to each person who's speaking to them to figure out what needs to be done in that particular situation. So it's a very big problem in human life as well, and I want you to think about it until the end of this course, and after that you can stop thinking about it. So thank you. Until you become the president. If you become the president, you have to start thinking about it all over again. So I'll see you guys on Friday.